All right, chapter 20 showed us what sort of the early Renaissance in Northern Europe looked like. On direct contrast to that, we're going to now see what's going on at the same time, but in Italy. Okay, so we're going to see a little bit of recap from the last, but just try to keep it all contextualized and put in perspective. We've talked already about the term humanism, but I just want to go back over that and reiterate it. It's a very important term to know as we try to get into the mindset of really, why should the art that has worked change, right? Well, now we're trying to redefine it within this new context, and one of those is that many artists are using this idea that God's greatest creation is man. And if that's true, right, if we hold that, biblically, God creates man in his own image, then he must be the highest form. If he's the highest form, then that must be the best thing to sculpt and to paint and to build our life around and our buildings. And we'll talk about how the human proportions relate to buildings. But that then would be the greatest thing that we could do to sort of praise God, is the idea, right? And two, really, we're also looking at the church is still the biggest patron, so you're not going to say no. You're still going to have to carry a lot of religious themes. So even if you're tending to become a little bit more secular in your thinking within humanism, you still have to answer to the church. So there's that going on. We are going to see that the Renaissance is dated from the 15th century, so around the 1400s, and continues to the 17th century. So we're going to see a lot of like early, middle, and late rises in the Renaissance. Okay, if you want more information on that, you can watch the film on Canopy and check out the YouTube link there for some quicker sort of visuals and explanations of all that. Now, we've talked already about Giotto, his fresco, and a little bit's important, right? If you need to, you can recap and go back over that. But this is the first steps that we're breaking away from Gothic style and Gothic representations. That's why it's important, okay? And a further step away from that, if we're looking at 1400, truly, they say, okay, the Renaissance starts in 1400. So here in 1401, we have this major competition that's held for sculptors in Italy. And the idea was that they were to be, you could see the common shape that all the artists were given, and they had to create a design that was going to then be one of many designs that would be put on a door, right? These bronze doors. So that was the idea for this baptistry of San Giovanni. Of all these contestants, 7 were chosen, and then two of the examples I put here because they are 2 amazing artists, Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Right? These 2 artists go on to have incredible fame, but at the time they're 23 and 24 years old. They both, what the judges saw in this and what's sort of remarkable about it is that we see the male nude form on display, very much Greek Roman. So this is where that humanist idea of going back to the classics is starting to visually play in. The nude form itself is still seen as shocking. It's becoming more and more accepted, but it's still seen as shocking. Just to have somebody naked on an image needs a lot more justification. Adam and Eve, okay, it makes some sense, but what else out of context? So just to see, Abraham or Isaac, because we're both seeing that same sacrifice of Isaac going on here. So seeing more the male nude form. So right here, right, the nude form that's happening. Not so much up here, right, partially clothed. But here you're on full front display, well, conceptually, why do we have to have that? Well, it's just more part of that Greco-Roman influence. Ghiberti becomes one of the first art historians of the Renaissance. So it's kind of interesting. He's not only a part of the beginning, but he writes a lot about it, and that's where we get a lot of our facts. Eventually, the contest, is won by Ghiberti, and he's able to construct, the doors later, right? These are the doors, and in fact, I think these may be the replicas of them, because the others have been moved to a museum. So I think that you're seeing a replica here. But Brunelleschi is devastated by this, and he actually quits for a brief period of time. We'll see him later. He switches over to architecture, but that's how crushing it was. If you weren't the best, then why continue? But the Gates of Paradise are then created and manufactured, and Ghiberti goes on to really become a great teacher for artists like this. So yes, we're getting into the first of some people call them the Ninja Turtles, but we have Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo, right, Raphael, and we're going to talk about a lot of them. What's cool to know is that Donatello being the earliest, but the others start to overlap a little bit more, right? They weren't all at the height of their careers at the same time, so we're kind of spreading them out throughout this, but they are within between the 14 to 1500s. So we have this apprentice. He really does set himself apart from any other artist at the time. Not only because in this particular case he sculpts the nude male freestanding, and so that itself is pretty amazing, right? We'd seen support, so now we see this great contrapposto stance, really accentuated where the form curves. That was developed by the Greeks, used again by the Romans, but it shows a mastery of materials, right? A lot of these arms, right? The sword itself is not only part of the story of David, but it's very important here for this how the body is held up structurally. But it's very interesting because we have this very young boy who's how do you say? There's more of an innocence to him. It doesn't look like this guy is the slayer of giants. So you can tell already that there's a lot of personal sort of liberties being taken within the subject matter, and just kind of tacking it onto a biblical theme, right? You can kind of see how they just put them together, and it works, but in ways, in my opinion, it still doesn't, because we do know that Donatello was very much homosexual at the time, so there's a lot of speculation that these could have been lovers and such. And while it's not accepted, it is a lot with artists. It is known, but they still kind of had to sort of hide it and keep it on the sidelines. Other words, you could get excommunicated from the church and such. So there is still a little bit of hush about it at this time. So if you want to know more about the sculpture itself, you can check out the link. But Donatello really sort of sets the bar again, just like Giotto did. Donatello will raise it again for artists to make these perfect human forms. One of the next that is that we talked about already within the Netherlands is linear perspective. Now, we've already seen a little bit of Brunelleschi over here, right? And so, while he sort of falls away as far as becoming that artist of two-dimensional sculpture, he really puts himself into the game with creating linear perspective. I've talked about this already a little bit before. Some of the terms you need to know: horizon line, vanishing points. This allows artists to give a greater illusion of space, a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Okay, so you can check out the YouTube link there. And this is he's actually working with another artist. His name is Masaccio, and Masaccio is sort of like putting into practice what he and Brunelleschi are talking about. And he was, we don't know of him much because he died so young, but he was the one who really sort of started breaking away from the guild format of one's master. So we call this emulation, right? This is where you're trained from your master to paint in a certain way, and in ways even a certain style, but you're supposed to kind of, now he's adding to it, right? If you can master what your master has, now you want to do more, right? That's sort of a personal ambition we all have. And so, he's starting to take these techniques and then those of perspective and really add on to what he has been taught in the guild. These pieces are very popular and well known as some of the very first pieces that show the vanishing point. His most famous, though, is this in the Holy Trinity. Okay, because what we see here with this is that if you walked in, and if you look at the YouTube link, it gives you a great idea on where this is placed within the chapel. And this is your eye line. Like, that's going to be the height, really, of your eyes. Like, if you stood next to this, right, you can imagine your head being right around here. So you are then looking up, right? So he's used perspective in a really creative way, not only to give a sense of going back, but those same receding lines come right down to where if you are standing in that center piece, like you can imagine walking up to this wall at this fresco, looking up and seeing this crucified form in front of you. So not only does it look like it's receding or going upwards, but then it's also going back into space. So this is sort of a really remarkable piece. And with that, usually, we think of like two-dimensional work starting and maybe the vanishing points and stuff being down here. And there's sometimes arbitrary. Here he's used Christ's form very specifically to not only be the center of the composition in the center, but everything in it is perfectly symmetrically balanced. We see a lot of that Greco-Roman style within the architecture here, right? We have these Corinthian tops to these columns. Over here, we even have the Ionic expression of them. So if you remember that from the last semester's class in Greek architecture, but they're stealing a lot of ideas, right, and putting them into one. But this is a great example of how linear perspective is used in a composition. Other ways that compositions were then created, Pier della Francesca, and I have a film of him on Canopy as well that you can check out, is sort of this strong triangular format. We're going to see this a lot in the Renaissance, right? This idea that here's the base, this is where all the visual weight is balanced off of, then it's coming up to a point, receding back to a point. So these triangles are very, very important. He's very renowned in the 15th century, comes from Tuscany. He had several wealthy patrons, including the Medicis, and so if you were part of the Medici's patronage, then you were going to find yourself in a lot of nice situations to be creating and getting paid for it. This, though, was created for a wall in what's kind of known as a city hall. So this is where it's different, is we have a very sacred image being put in a secular space. Right, so it's kind of like, whoa, wait a second, what if we all don't believe that way, or, and so that's where it kind of gets a little bit more shocking, is that it's out of the church. We do see a lot of foreshortening happening. We see Christ's leg up in front, and then, and we can definitely tell that he's behind. Same with these two characters. This one, the head is larger and sort of recedes back. So that's what I mean by foreshortening, as then if we go back in space. What's interesting is the space itself back here is still very sort of unimaginative, right? We do see this row of trees and another row. So there's some ideas that perspective-wise are being used, but it's definitely an afterthought compared to the figures. So you can see that there's an emphasis on the figures. The guard with the head on the tomb, leaning right here, is actually supposedly a self-portrait of Francesca. So that's where I mentioned before, artists like to sort of throw those in or hide those in there. I talked about how the soldiers form the base of the compositional triangle with Christ as the head of sort of this pinnacle. The muscular bodies you see are definitely Greco-Roman sculpture inspired. I don't think everybody was working out as much as the paintings suggest that they may have. But they tell some very interesting stories. They do have some symbolism in there, but not as much as what you'd see happening in the north. One art piece that you will probably run into again and again in your life as you go through museums and even gift stores, and this is a huge one for it, is the Birth of Venus, known for not only a lot of its symbolism and its allegory, But for Botticelli, it's very interesting because we do not see a lot of the female nude in sort of this middle age, or early Renaissance time. So we have this like Neoplatonism, as they refer to it, used for the Greek and Roman myths. And so we have art and literature, and they're sort of coming out in this artist's work, right? So he's added all these characters in for this symbolism from Greek allegory. This is not biblical, right? Which is very different from what we've seen so far. So Botticelli works in Florence and considered the most famous artist employed by the Medici family. And this piece is also created and based off a poem by Angelo Poliziano, and he was one of the leading humanist writers of this time, of that day, and I actually found the poem for you, so as I read it, maybe it'll help sort of put the images in perspective. Blown by the lascivious zephyrs to the shore, riding on the shell and the sky, seems as if rejoicing at the sight. You would say the foam and the sea were real, and real to the shell, real to the blowing of the winds. You could see the goddess with eyes resplendent in the sky, and the elements laughing about her. The hours treading the sand in white robes, the breeze curling their long and pliant hair, not one, yet not diverse, their countenance as seems proper for sisters. You would swear the goddess was really issuing from the waves, squeezing her tresses with her right hand, and with the other covering the apple of sweetness, and that, when her sacred and divine foot was imprinted on it, the sand clothed itself in grasses and flowers. Then might you see how the three nymphs welcomed her with cheerful and loving semblance into their midst, and wrapped her round with a starry dress. So, that in mind, there you go. There's a lot of the symbolism, and this piece itself sort of kind of goes into continuance, as if you recognize these characters, and then you take a look here as Botticelli this sort of takes some of those characters and adds into them. We've seen this one before, right? But he's playing around with these early Greek allegorical ideas, right? Which is very, very different, and being able to get away with them. It's starting to show the popularity of the Greek and Latin literature and how he's pulling from other sources. And this is where we're seeing even a further break from the church, right? So this is painted for the Medici family. And that patronage, especially now being away from the church, has allowed for his own personal influences. So not only style, but a little bit more expression. He's conforming to the time, saying, okay, what's popular is human forms, painted realistically, blah, 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 blah. But I'm going to go ahead and add even my own twist, the things that I'm inspired by, which is this literature, these poems, right? So that's where these pieces become even more important in the scheme of art history. I've talked about printmaking before, and we've seen it in engraving last time. I'd like to throw in another one. And so it did start in the North. Printmaking develops in the East originally, but in the North we see the first of the presses and stuff. So Germany with Gutenberg, as I mentioned before, and with that we can see more mass production of works being created, and specifically on paper. Artists now are free to sort of explore some of their own themes and ideas. They don't have to just create for patrons. You can imagine materials are expensive, so it's not like you can just go out and just, I made 25 paintings for myself that may never sell, right? You got to put cost to it, but prints are different. They can be cheaper to make and cheaper to sell. This artist here, one reason why it's Palladio, and why this is famous, is that this shows sort of the beginning interest in sort of what Leonardo da Vinci will really build upon. But we look at all this musculature and you think, oh wow, yeah, a bunch of guys ripped, fighting it out. However, there's no possible way any of this musculature could happen at the same time. This is showing every muscle flexed, right? There's no way that you could flex every muscle in your body at the same time. Some have to relax while others are flexed. And so the interest is there, but the understanding isn't, right? And a lot of this comes because, we think, oh, they could just draw from cadavers. Well, no, that was very taboo still, right? That's not something you did. So anyway, that's where we see that it's sort of naive. But when you think of like the humanist concept, the questioning is there. Now we're going to see artists go and try to get those answers. So architecture, haven't really talked a whole lot about it before, but here's Brunelleschi again, right? As he starts to jump into his works, and we're gonna see even more and more of his name come up as his popularity in architecture grows. And Brunelleschi's popularity is really going to be brought together when we talk about the cathedral dome that he builds in Florence, and that even to this day we don't really know how he did it, and that's one of those amazing mysteries in art history, and we'll come across this quite a bit, and I did a lot with the last class, is that over time, whether through secret or technique or just a loss of sometimes even knowledge and understanding, like we just don't know how some of these works were created. And so Brunelleschi, after he loses that door competition and throws himself into more like linear perspective, right? He really makes a name for himself in this architecture. So we'll talk about it with that dome later on. Another part in Venice, and the reason why they're broken up like this is we have to understand that, yes, Italy sort of functions together, but these are city-states, right? They are sort of their own, you can consider them almost like countries, but they're not. They're a part of Italy, but they're these states, and they are really ruled by whoever's rich at the time, right? So the Medicis have their thing going on. Then in Venice, you have a whole other thing going on. So it's pretty interesting how they operate individually. We only think of them like as completely together, but really they didn't really get along a whole lot with each other. So Venice is also growing for many different reasons, and for those, as we know, with Venice and having the canals and being sort of the floating city that it is, we see their investment really in architecture. They are more influenced by the Byzantine style of art instead of the sort of Greco-Roman style. And the reason why is that near Venice, Byzantine art had an influence. It never made itself further south. And that we studied in the last class. So if you need a recap on that, you can go back in your art history book and look through it. But these were, created because there's wealth. People are making wealth. It's happier times. This is a great example of a type of home. You'll never see this in Rome with the sort of ornamentation, which looks a little Middle Eastern in its or Islamic in ways, because that's that Byzantine style still coming through. That's blended well. You'll never see this sort of stuff in Rome. It's a little asymmetrical. It's not completely balanced, and that's what makes this stuff very specific to Venice. Painting wise, we do see painters, but like Bellini, but I mean they really sort of never reach the largest of heights like we know of other painters. There's a YouTube link that goes into more of the detail of this work and what's interesting, but Venice is just one of three main cities in Italian painting. We know from Florence, Rome, and Venice. Those are really sort of it. And for putting Venice on the map in the scheme of painting at this time is Bellini, and he trained in the Gothic style, which is why we see still sort of with the succession of space, sort of there's still things that are kind of flat and they're not dealing with a lot of natural light. They're still more idealized. You can tell he's probably working in a studio and not from models and things like that are brought in. He didn't really paint in his own way until 1470, so this one's still pretty new in his idea, but here he creates this figure St. Francis in the desert, which you know the story, and in the stigmata that would be at his hands, so he's still wanting to tell the story, these biblical stories. But what's interesting is that there's a lot more Flemish influence in his work as well. Like if we compare this to what's going on in the Northern Renaissance, you'd say like, oh wow, yeah, that's very stylistic, right? He received a lot of training from Flemish artists, and he is, including from his family members who are also artists. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of this, coming out in his work. So he's using lots of symbolism, which is, not seen in the others. They were pretty straightforward. When we think of like Donatello's David, it's telling the story quickly. But here we have a lot of other little motifs. He also combined tempera and oil into his very specific style. So that is a little bit unheard of, right? He's painting on wood, but he's combining these techniques that are known as a Venetian style of painting and coloring. So that's what really sort of like elevates his work and people taking it seriously. The last piece that we're going to look at, another part, but he is, here we have Mantegna, and great little YouTube link there to check out. But his brother-in-law is Piero della Francesca, which we've seen before with the pyramid structure of Christ on the tomb and the soldiers sleeping there. And so what makes this work so interesting is, and it's known as the foreshortened Christ. It actually wasn't supposed to be called that, but we've known it as that. And what we see here is something that just seems very disproportional, right? We see something that seems very small almost down here, and this is just very large. And so we're seeing an attempt, a little bit of understanding, and then a lack of understanding at the same time within the piece, right? If it was true to foreshortening, these feet would be so big, right, to the way that the size of the head, that it would, we'd need maybe even like a longer canvas to work on. We would need those feet to be upright, but it would cover also Christ's face. So in order to do that, he tilts the figure down and is trying to figure out how to do that, but then still crams in the size. So we get a little bit of compaction, we'll say, to the body. But we know it's Christ because of the wounds, right? And these themselves are painted in such a way that it just is beautifully painful, I guess is the best way I can put it, right? We even see the expression and the emotion on the individual's eyes. When we think of even Giotto, he's trying to do something like that, but just it's not happening. And a lot of that because he's also doing it on frescoes, right? So he doesn't have all the time in the world to do it. But this is probably the most drastic use of foreshortening during this period, and it's just sort of a great example of not necessarily a master work, but a great example of what artists are trying to accomplish with their search in the arts at this particular time. So that's the best way I can say this. It's weird to talk about a piece that's not accurate or not seemingly correct. Right? We wouldn't in a class do that. It would kind of be, okay, receives a less of a grade. It didn't hit this high of a technique, but he's really trying hard, and we don't see others like this. So that's why it's kind of hung around.